When he walked into the courtroom, people actually stopped breathing. Not from fear, more from the jolt of recognition. Everyone had seen his last name in the news, whispered over coffee tables, passed around local Facebook groups with raised eyebrows. But no one imagined he would do what he did. Right in front of Judge Caprio. It was an ordinary Providence morning. Low winter sun across the wooden benches, the familiar shuffle of residents waiting their turn, the soft clack of the clerk's keyboard. Nothing hinted that the air was about to snap like a stretched wire. The door opened. He stepped in. A young man, 20, maybe 21. Lean, almost sharp in the way he moved, as if unused to sitting still. His clothes were dark, unfussy, but expertly tailored. On his neck hung a university lanyard, not Ivy League, but respected enough to signal ambition. In his hand, a phone wrapped in matte black film, gripped like a shield. He didn't look at a single person. Not at the clerk, not at the officers, not at Judge Caprio. He moved through the aisle as though the building belonged to someone else, and he was merely passing through. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a thin line of tension in his jaw. His case was called. A minor infraction. Resident-only parking after midnight. A murmur rolled across the benches. That's it? Years of local scandals tied to his family name? And this was all? It felt almost comically small. People leaned in, suspicious that the real story had not yet surfaced. Judge Caprio glanced over the file, then looked up. "Sir, please step forward." The young man walked to the podium with a measured, almost chilly calm. And then, with the ease of someone performing a gesture he'd already rehearsed, he lifted his hand and gave the judge a single, unmistakable sign of contempt. Not wild, not reckless. Cold. Intended. Quiet as a blade sliding from a sheath. The room froze. A soft gasp from an older woman somewhere behind him. A sharp inhale from a man near the aisle. A whispered, "Oh, my Lord," drifting across the silence. Even the officers stiffened, unsure whether to intervene or wait for the judge's cue. But Judge Caprio did not erupt. He did not raise his voice. He simply stared at the young man for several long, carefully measured seconds. Seconds that felt like the entire room was suspended above a drop they could not see. Then he spoke, his voice low, even, almost gentle. "Young man, you didn't do that because of me. You did it because you want something noticed. The question is, what exactly?" His calmness unsettled the room more than any outburst could have, because suddenly everyone felt it. This wasn't about a parking ticket. Something deeper had just stepped into the light. He didn't answer the judge's question right away. Instead, he shifted his weight, tapped his thumb against the edge of his phone, and exhaled through his nose, as if bracing for something he'd avoided for a long time. Judge Caprio repeated, quieter this time. "Your name?" The young man lifted his gaze, not fully, just enough to show he had heard. "Ilya Volkov." The room reacted before the judge did. A ripple of instant recognition. Not loud, but unmistakable. Shoes adjusting, hands folding, murmurs swallowed before forming words. His last name had been all over the local news 2 years earlier. Financial irregularities, foreign account transfers, speculation from commentators who exaggerated more than they understood. No criminal charges, no formal accusations that stuck, but enough smoke to stain every corner of town gossip. Yet when Ilya spoke, there was no accent, no theatrical hardness, just a flat, American voice, clipped and tired. Judge Caprio nodded slowly and asked for his address, a routine question, usually answered without a second thought. But Ilya paused. Not long, only a second or two, but long enough for the judge to notice. Long enough for the older couple in the second row to exchange a glance. Long enough for the clerk's typing to halt mid-word. When the judge repeated the question, gently this time, Ilya finally said the address. The words fell without shape or energy, like he was reading them from a page he didn't want to see again. A faint whisper drifted from somewhere near the back. Why'd he hesitate? The clerk shot the whisperer a warning look, but the thought was already circulating. People straightened in their seats, tuning themselves to every small signal the young man gave off. Judge Caprio moved to the next question, why he made the obscene gesture. Ilya's jaw tightened. He didn't look angry. He looked cornered. You wouldn't listen anyway, he said. No bravado, no swagger. The sentence landed not as defiance, but resignation, like someone speaking from under a weight that no one else could see. The judge didn't respond immediately. He simply studied him, the way he often did when trying to understand the part of a case that wasn't written on paper. He opened the folder, scanning through the previous citations, and that's when the first crack in the young man's armor appeared. Not in him, but in the facts. 12 prior tickets over the past year. All paid on time. Every one of them. No hearings, no appeals, no attempts to avoid responsibility. A young man who walked in with a gesture of contempt had quietly resolved a dozen violations without protest? It didn't add up. Judge Caprio looked up, the file still open in his hand. You've been cited multiple times before, he said calmly. Yet you paid each fine promptly. No objections, no delays, no court appearances. Why start today like this? The room leaned in, not visibly, but in spirit. They felt the contradiction too. Even those who came in expecting to dislike him sensed that something didn't match the version of him they'd imagined. Ilya didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the podium. His fingers tapped lightly against the black film on his phone. And from the corner of the room, a man, gray-haired, quiet, shifted uneasily, as if he knew exactly why the boy couldn't speak. But the judge didn't push. He simply closed the file thoughtfully and said, "There's more here than a ticket. We'll take this one step at a time." And for the first time, Ilya's shoulders dropped. Just a fraction. Not relief. Not surrender. Something closer to being seen, even if he didn't want to be. Judge Caprio lifted the ticket photo from the folder, holding it between his fingers with the same care he used for every detail. "Ilya," he said gently, "you told me the car wasn't yours. You also said you weren't driving it that night." He paused, then angled the photo toward him. "But this picture shows you stepping out of the driver's seat. No accusation, just fact." The impact was immediate. A quiet shock moved through the benches like a cold current. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her chest. A man in his 70s whispered, "Well, that settles it," before his wife nudged him sharply. Ilya blinked once, only once, but his throat shifted, as if a word had tried to rise and then retreated. He didn't defend himself, didn't offer some quick excuse. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles paling under the strain. Someone behind him, an older gentleman with a weathered cap, let out a frustrated groan. "Same story every time," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Some people think rules are optional." That comment hit Ilya harder than the photo. He turned slightly, just enough to reveal something that hadn't appeared before. Fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of punishment, but something deeper, older, lodged somewhere beneath the surface. Judge Caprio noticed it instantly. He set the photo down. His voice softened, almost conversational. "Ilya, do you live with your father right now?" The room went utterly still. It wasn't a procedural question. Everyone over 50 in that courtroom knew the difference. They understood the weight beneath it, the kind that comes from family fractures no law book can address. Ilya's jaw loosened, but no sound came out. A few seconds passed. Then, one more. "No," he finally said. The word was thin, almost fragile. A thread stretched too far. A sense of recognition swept the room. Not sympathy, not yet, but an instinctive awareness that whatever front the young man carried into the courtroom had a crack running through it. Judge Caprio didn't move, didn't shift in his chair. He simply held that silence the way a doctor holds a stethoscope, listening for what isn't said. "So," the judge continued, quietly, "help me understand. You denied driving. You hesitated about your address. You came in here carrying something heavier than a parking ticket. What's going on?" For the first time, Ilya's fingers stopped tapping the phone. His shoulders stiffened, and he looked down as though the podium itself had become difficult to face. He swallowed. His lips tightened. But nothing came out. Someone in the back row sighed impatiently. Another murmured, "Just tell him, kid." But Judge Caprio lifted his hand subtly, not to silence Ilya, but to silence the room. This wasn't a spectacle to him. It was a diagnostic moment, the kind where a young man's choices tilt toward one of two futures. Ilya's breath shook, not visibly, but audibly enough for the microphone to catch the faint tremor. "It's not about the ticket," he said at last, barely above a whisper. The courtroom leaned in. Every bench, every breath, every tiny movement fell into alignment with those words. And though he didn't continue, the pause that followed held more truth than any confession. Because everyone could feel it now. The gesture he'd made, the lie about the car, the stiffness, the silence. None of it belonged to arrogance. Something else was pushing him. Something he hadn't said. Something that was about to break the surface. Judge Caprio let the boy's unfinished sentence linger, giving it space to breathe. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady, almost warm. "All right, Ilya. Then let's talk plainly. Why did you say the car wasn't yours?" The young man's shoulders lifted just slightly, as if bracing for a blow that wasn't coming. He didn't look up. His voice thinned to a narrow, controlled line. "Because it isn't mine," he said. "It's registered to my father, and I don't want anything of his." No anger, no bitterness, just a weary finality, the kind that doesn't come from a single argument, but from years of slow, grinding disappointment. For a moment, no one reacted. Then the mood shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, like a wind changing direction. In the back row, a woman whispered, "Oh dear," as if the pieces had finally begun to align. Judge Caprio studied him carefully. "And the reason you lied about driving it? Does that have to do with what we all heard on the news some time ago?" The courtroom stilled again, this time with a different kind of tension. Not scandal, human hesitation. People understood the risk of stepping into a wound you can't see. Ilya didn't answer. Not immediately. A soft hum of the ceiling vent filled the silence. Someone cleared their throat. The clerk typed 2 letters and stopped. Finally, with a breath that seemed to cost him something, he said, "He left. That's all. He left in the middle of the night. No message, no explanation. Just gone." His voice didn't crack, but the emptiness in it landed harder than emotion. A man in the second row lowered his eyes. Another shook his head slowly. Ilya continued, quieter. "He left me the car, and the bill for the attorney, like handing off a suitcase he was tired of carrying." Judge Caprio closed his eyes for a brief moment, a gesture so small most people would have missed it. But those who watched him closely knew it meant he had just grasped the full weight of the situation. When he looked at Ilya again, his expression was steady, compassionate, without being sentimental. "So, the gesture you made earlier," the judge said softly, "that wasn't meant for me, was it?" For the first time since he'd entered the room, Ilya lifted his head fully. His eyes weren't defiant. They were exhausted. "It wasn't for you," he said. "It was for every adult who pretends they're holding things together when they're not. Every one of them who leaves someone else to clean up the mess." The words fell heavy, but transparently honest. There was no show of rebellion, only the blunt truth of someone who had stopped expecting stability from the people who were supposed to provide it. A ripple of quiet shock passed through the benches. This wasn't arrogance. This wasn't entitlement. It was a young man finally reaching the end of a rope he had been clutching alone. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, voice low enough that it felt like a private conversation despite the full room. "You've been carrying more than a parking ticket," he said, "and more than any young man should have to carry on his own. No theatrics, no speeches, just a clear recognition of a burden that had finally revealed itself. And in that recognition, something in the room shifted again, this time toward a stillness filled not with judgment, but with understanding. The next moment would decide whether the boy stayed closed off, or finally allowed the truth to finish rising. Judge Caprio rested his palms on the bench, not in authority, but in quiet grounding. The courtroom had shifted from tension to a fragile calm, the kind that follows a truth spoken too late and too softly. He closed the folder containing the citations, not abruptly, not with the weight of judgment, but with the deliberate care of someone setting aside the least important part of the story. "Ilya," he said, "I don't see a troublemaker standing in front of me. I see a young man who must answer for his own choices, but not for the choices his father made." The sentence settled over the room like a blanket drawn over a restless child. Even those who had walked in ready to condemn him now sat motionless, letting the words sink in. Ilya didn't lift his head, but something in his posture loosened, as though a knot behind his ribs had given way. The judge continued, voice steady and unhurried. "Let's address one thing at a time. Why deny driving the car? Why hide something so small?" This time, Ilya didn't hesitate. He exhaled, a slow, uneven breath. "Because every time, every single time, somebody hears my last name, they put me in his shadow." His eyes remained down, but there was no anger, only a tiredness that carried its own gravity. "I didn't want to be pulled back into his situation. Didn't want anyone thinking I was tied to whatever he did or didn't do." He paused. "Or that I'm destined to follow the same path." A faint sound rolled through the room, not a gasp, not a murmur, more like a collective inward breath from people recognizing something painfully familiar: the fear of inheriting a story you never chose. Judge Caprio nodded subtly, the lines on his face deepening with understanding. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "It takes maturity to admit what you're running from." Another pause, this one full, intentional. "Here's my decision." The room straightened, almost in unison. "The ticket is dismissed." A soft rustle ran through the benches. Not applause, not relief, but a warm exhale from people who appreciated fairness when they saw it. The judge raised a finger gently. "But hear me well. I'm not excusing what you did in here today. I'm giving you a chance to step forward without the weight of your father's mistakes. A chance to show who you are. Take it seriously." He let the silence settle before finishing. You get one warning. Only one. Next time, you answer for your actions without any leeway. Understand? Ilya nodded slowly. Not with the half-hearted shrug of someone indulged, but with the solemnity of a person recognizing that the road ahead had just changed direction. "Thank you, sir," he said. His voice was steadier now, though softer. "I haven't heard an adult speak like this in a very long time." The words weren't meant to impress. They sounded more like a confession, a quiet acknowledgement that he'd been navigating deeper waters than anyone in the room had realized. Someone in the second row dabbed their eye with a tissue. A man near the aisle folded his arms, not in judgment, but in a kind of protective empathy rarely seen in a courtroom. Judge Caprio leaned back, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Everybody grows up eventually," he said, "some earlier than others." And for the first time since walking into the room, Ilya stood without bracing himself. Lighter, though he didn't yet see it. The moment held steady, almost peaceful. But peace never stays long when a story this heavy is still unfinished. The next sound, the scrape of a chair in the back row, would shatter that calm and take the story in a direction no one expected. The quiet that followed the judge's decision felt almost sacred, like the first moment of stillness after a long storm. But it didn't last. From the far end of the courtroom came the faint scrape of a chair, soft but sharp enough to break the fragile calm. Everyone turned instinctively, expecting someone gathering their coat or adjusting their seat. Instead, a man rose. He was older, gray at the temples, coat worn at the cuffs, shoulders rounded from years rather than defeat. He didn't look toward the judge or the clerk. He didn't glance at the officers. He simply stepped into the aisle with the cautious steps of someone hoping not to be noticed. But he was noticed. By Ilya, most of all. The young man froze, breath caught halfway between inhale and exhale. His eyes widened, not in anger, not in recognition shaped by warmth, but in the startled disbelief of someone seeing a ghost walk through daylight. He whispered, barely audible, "Dad." The man did not turn. He reached the courtroom door, pushed it open, and slipped out as quietly as he could, vanishing into the hallway without a backward glance. A stunned hush filled the room. Some people had seen nothing but a stranger. Others, catching the resemblance, exchanged uneasy looks. A few older spectators lowered their heads, the way one does when witnessing a wound reopened. Judge Caprio watched Ilya carefully. Not intrusively, attentively. "Ilya," he asked softly, "do you know who that was?" Ilya's lips parted, but no sound emerged. He looked torn between running after the man and staying rooted to the spot. His hand hovered near the podium, gripping the edge like an anchor. Finally, he managed, I'm not sure." But everyone knew what he meant. Not sure if it was him. Not sure if it could be him. Not sure if he was ready to face the truth either way. Judge Caprio didn't press. He allowed the moment to exist exactly as it was, uncertain, raw, unbearably human. He spoke only when the weight of silence had settled evenly across the room. "Sometimes," he said gently, "the truth finds us in hallways we aren't prepared to walk down." The words carried through the air with the slow, deliberate cadence of something meant to linger long after the doors closed. Ilya blinked hard, trying to steady himself. Then he stepped back from the podium. Not abruptly, just enough to signal that whatever battle had brought him into the courtroom had shifted to a different front. He turned toward the exit, hesitated, then looked at the judge. "I'll come back," he said quietly. "Not for a ticket, just in a better way. if that's all right." Judge Caprio offered a faint smile, the kind that held encouragement without expectation. "These doors are open to everyone," he replied, "especially to those trying to grow." Ilya nodded once, firm, resolute. He pushed open the courtroom door, stepping into the hallway where the unknown waited. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed more like a beginning than an ending. As the room slowly resumed its ordinary rhythm, a voice, calm, reflective, seemed to settle over the final moment. In life, our hardest battles are seldom with laws or rules. They're fought with the shadows that follow us, the ones we don't choose, but must eventually face. Some run from them, some confront them, and sometimes the bravest steps happen in a quiet courtroom under the steady gaze of Judge Caprio. And with that, the story didn't end. It simply paused on the threshold of whatever came next.